Hello everybody. This short tutorial video is meant to support my Thursday morning 3D Design 2 course. This week we were looking at how to start creating a 3D product shot. And I'm going to be using an unusual suspect to start me in the modeling process. I'm going to be using Illustrator to do a couple of things. Hopefully reinforce the fact that vector graphics, as we know it from Illustrator, relates directly to what we see inside of our 3D viewports when we're looking at things like curves and we're looking at things like edges on our 3D geometry that really truly in the end they're pretty much all the same thing. In Illustrator we only have the X and the Y order, but when we look at tools like Maya we do have our Z order, which gives us our three-dimensional world. When we bring this Illustrator file in, we're going to see how that path, as they call them in Illustrator, can quickly be converted to a curve, and that curves can be utilized to be lofted into shapes, or they can be revolved around into different things, into making our 3D geometry and get us started towards our eventually our polygonal geometry that we're going to use to render at the end of the day. Now, this is my first tutorial video for this section, and I just wanted to point out to my students that it is hypercritical that you go onto my assignments and dig in and really truly understand what the specifications are. I want to pretend that I am your manager or I am somebody, your director, working with you for your assignments out there in real life. And you know, it's super critical when you sit down for a team scrum with your management or your production team, that you take really strong notes and that you follow along very, very carefully and make sure that you're, that you're producing things to the specifications that your team requires. And I just updated actually this assignment this morning just to be absolutely sure that you're working in a folder called your name _ assignment 1, and this will be a precedent we set for all assignments. And in my case, it's going to look something like Kevin Element assignment 1. So just to get myself started, I won't do this in future tutorials because it will become redundant, but in this folder here where I'm going to keep all of my assignments for the semester, I'm just going to start off and make sure that I give myself a solid space to work and make sure that I spell this right. In the end, this folder is just going to be zipped up with all of our goodies inside. We're just going to right click on it on a Mac. We're going to very quickly just compress that to a zip file, or on a PC you're going to use the compression tools there in Windows to compress it and ultimately put it up to Google Drive. So I just want to set that precedent right now that I've got a strong name. That's my name. When I download all of your zip files, everything's going to be nicely organized inside of my marking world, and I can quickly see who's submitted work, and I can drill into your directories and see your work nicely organized. And throughout this process, I don't want to use names like silly plate or funky fork or things like that. I want to use really strong names throughout the process to keep myself organized, not only just from a professional perspective, but organized also from, where in the world am I going to find these things in the future? And you'll see what I'm talking about here in a moment. So for my project, I've decided, after looking around the web, that I'm going to recreate this shot to the best of my abilities. I often say to my students, as a quote from our good friend Pablo Picasso, one of the greatest artists of all time, that good artists borrow, but great artists steal. Now that's not to say that we want to copy artwork to make it look completely 100% identical, of course, unless that was maybe our purpose. Maybe that's what our learning strategy was, and we did that often in my visual arts school. We tried our best to copy art, to learn from the masters. But when we start to look at beautiful things like this image here, the depth of field is wonderful. The textures on the table are going to be fun to try to recreate. I want to build those peanuts and actually use bump maps and maybe potentially displacement maps or normal maps to make them look bumpy and lumpy. I want to get the glass to look hyper realistic. I'm really studying the image right now and thinking, not only is there beautiful texture in the background, it's got the depth of field, that out of focus look that I want from the final render. But there's also a challenge in here. Around the top of this product, there are sort of odd moments. There's this thread that's used for the lid that I'm going to have to recreate, and that's going to cause a problem down the road. So while I'm looking at this image, I'm thinking about all of the things that I'm going to have to tackle, and imagining, what the project's going to look like as I move through it. So I know I'm going to have to get these textures for the table. I'm going to have to create these peanuts. I know I'm going to augment this more. I want to put a sandwich potentially in and actually try to render some realistic bread, which is a whole other challenge when you're thinking about how light penetrates in through things like subsurface scattering as they penetrate into bread and food and make it look delicious. It's a real challenge. Now, a different product like a wine bottle wouldn't be so hard. I could do that very easily, but I want to challenge myself as somebody who's been in this space for a while to really pull this off. And in the end, I know that if I try to copy this image, I'm learning a lot, but it's going to evolve. Something else is going to come out of this project. Even though I'm trying to copy it, as Pablo Picasso once said, great artists steal. I'm going to try to steal this, but invariably something else will pop out of the top. Something else will happen that will be unique and it will be my own. And of course, I do need to think about this front of the jar. I'm not just going to leave this as glass when I'm done. I'm going to put a label on this, and that is part of the assignment. And whether I just use, a label that I find from the internet, a Skippy label or something, an existing product, or if I try to go into Illustrator and make my own fancy label, in the end, the goal is to get this properly modeled and properly textured so that we're using bitmaps to create a label for this product, make it look hyper realistic, get the glass looking just right, get fingerprints and smudges and all kinds of cool things happening on the surfaces, so that the viewer is going to believe that this is really actually in the real world. So I found this image. I'm just going to right click on it. I noticed that when I went to this web page and I right clicked on it, I couldn't save as. So I actually had to go into the HTML. So I right clicked and I inspected the image, and I noticed that in this div, sort of hiding inside of it down in here, there was this picture class. And down here, when I clicked on this, I was able to open the image in a new tab. So I had to do a little bit of hacking to get this image out at high resolution. I do want this to be 1920 by 1080. I want it to be a larger image. If it was too small, 320 by 240, then I would be zooming in on pixels inside of Illustrator when I tried to do this trace. Because my next goal is to try my best to get the profile of this product in vector graphics in an unlikely tool in Adobe Illustrator. So now that I have it isolated in its own tab, I'm going to right click, I'm going to copy the image, I'm going to head on over to Illustrator, and it doesn't matter which file format I pick, what size I pick. It has to be Adobe Illustrator, but the resolution of this file doesn't really matter. I'm just going to paste this down, and oddly, my picture nicely fits inside. You might need to resize it to fit. It doesn't matter if it's centered off. In the end, we're going to have to do some work over in Maya to get this centered into our viewport. But I do want to point out in Illustrator, there's a really cool feature, useful for a lot of reasons. If we double click on a layer, we can choose to make it a template layer. And this is where, naming is very important. So I'm going to make sure that the system knows that this is my tracing layer. I could call this whatever I want, but this is more for me. So I know that this layer is the tracing layer. And when I choose template, it locks it, it dims it. I can change the dim value, and that's really cool. And when I hit OK, it's something I cannot draw on now, and I can't pick it up and I can't move it. So it's truly a tracing layer. So to keep going, I need another layer here. I'm going to click on this plus button down here, give myself a layer, and this is where I'm going to put my jar. So I'm just going to rename that, and I'm going to tap Command R, to give me some rulers, and using the selection tool, I'm just going to drag a guide out to the center of my jar. And you're going to hear me interchangeably use the term jar and geometry and illustration, geometry, jar, illustration, because in the end, this is, what I'm tracing here is going to end up inside of Maya. And I'm going to revolve this path that I'm about to create inside of Illustrator. So I've got a guide bisecting the center of my geometry, because in the end I'm going to revolve what I'm sketching now. And it's great to have that guide because when I'm using my pen tool, it will snap to the edge of that center point, which is really great. So I'm going to switch over to my pen tool. And this is just as much a practice of how to use the pen tool as much as it is a way of looking at a different way of modeling or preparing our curves for Maya. Now, one thing I have to keep in mind, this photograph was obviously taken with perspective. And if I just traced the shape as it is, and I tried to revolve it, then the top of my jar would actually have this very strange curve to it. I have to think about the isometric views. And when I say that, over here in Maya, we've got the different viewports. We've got the perspective view, which would be ultimately what we would see here, similar to this photograph of the jar. But then we have our other viewports. So we've got the top, and we've got the left, and the bottom, and the right. And when we go over to those different views, then we're seeing the geometry without perspective. We're just seeing it, directly on the side view, for example, or the top. And those are very important views to jump in and out of from time to time to make sure that we're positioned properly in our scene, or that, for example, the bottom of this jar is completely flat and that the top of that jar is completely flat. So I'm just going to set up a new file in Maya, and I'm going to save it right away. First thing I like to do, and I am using my external hard drive. And in order to see my external hard drive, on a Mac anyway, I'm not sure how a PC behaves, I actually have to type in. So look in volumes and press return. And there it is. Otherwise, it doesn't appear for some strange reason in the actual system itself. So I have to type in volumes and press the return key, and then I can see my external hard drive. Keep myself organized. There's my assignment 1 folder. And what would be a good name for this? Well, let's keep it familiar. Kevin element underscore product shot. So when I open up all of your files, I'm going to easily see who created what. And don't forget, I've got a lot of students, so that putting your name into your files is really helpful for me. I'm going to hit Save As, and we're seeing the world here in our perspective view. But when I press the space bar and just tap it, I can see there's the top, the front, and the side. And I know this is review, but when I do the job of positioning this in my world, I'm going to be using my side view. So I have to think sort of down the road, like when I bring this in, I want my jar to be perfectly flat on the ground. I want the sides to be nice, just the way I want them. And up here at the top, I'm going to need the top of my jar to be completely flat as well. So when I'm in Illustrator, I have to kind of imagineer now what the bottom of this jar looks like. And to make sure that it's completely flat, I can put my pen tool, and just to point out, I'm using that tool here, where I roughly think an average would be between the top, if I imagined an oval, where that jar bottom is, I'm just going to guesstimate. Now, once again, this is art, and I'm not going to make it perfect, but I'm just going to guesstimate where the floor would be if I could look at this from the left view. So I put my pen right onto that guide that I created from my ruler. I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to press the Shift key while I'm clicking to ensure that my Bezier handles are completely, perfectly 90 degrees to that guide. And that would ensure that the next anchor point that I create in here, when I press Shift, you'll notice that It's awesome. The pen tool sticks to the Y order and will not go up and down. So I can create a perfect baseline for my object. I'm just going to come out here, click and drag. Ooh, this is where it's, the pen tool, you got to practice. I'm going to hold the shift key now and it's going to snap to the floor. And then I haven't let go of my mouse yet. I haven't let go of the left mouse button. I'm just going to tap the option key to change its direction. And a lot of people go like this. They'll draw a big, huge Bezier curve. And you have to remember that Bezier handles, they manage the tension on the curve, on the path. So we don't want a lot of tension here. We just want to bring this up. So I'm just going to bring it up a few pixels, aiming this curve in this direction. Then I can come up to here and click and drag. I'm holding down the left mouse button, tapping option to then change its direction into a cusp. Shift, I'm holding option and shift and the left click all at the same time to change its direction straight up, and then let go of the left click. Go straight up here holding the shift key, that's going to bind it to the X order. Click and drag, now it's going to go a little bit wild. Hold down I'm still holding left, I haven't let go of the left click yet. And then I hold shift, it snaps perfectly up and down, and then I tap the option key to change its direction. Now I can be a little bit more creative around this curve. I'm not going to worry too much about that. And then shift straight up. I'm going to guess where the top of that curve, or sort of the top of the lid might be. Click and drag straight up. And now I need to zoom in, get really close in there. While you're using the pen tool, and I haven't committed the path yet by pressing return, I can hold down the shift, I can hold down the space bar and drag the scene around, which is really nice, the artboard. And then I'm going to step over, thinking about the thickness of the glass in this jar now, I'm going to just step over to the left a little bit, click and drag, trying to match the handles on the other side, and then start to come on down and trace the interior profile of my jar. Now, a student had asked for this project, am I supposed to be making the label right now? No. We're supposed to be making just the exterior profile of our product. Carefully just hold down shift, and that's going to make sure that it goes straight down. It's going to be parallel to the path that's beside it. I'm going to hold down shift so it goes perfectly straight up and down, and then option to change its direction. And nice gentle Bezier handles so that things don't go too wild. Hold shift to tell it to go in that direction, and then shift to make sure that it stays on the floor, and then snap it perfectly to my guide. Now I have a lumpy part here, and that happens. We have to go back in later and tweak. And I know it's kind of strange that we're looking at Illustrator here in 3D class, but once more, the purpose of this is just to get us thinking that vector graphics are vector graphics, and that this path that we're creating in quotes and call it path is actually good, is just as much a curve, a Bezier curve in other tools like Maya and all of these other tools as well, like After Effects, and you're going to see Bezier curves everywhere. So getting really good at your pen tool in Photoshop, in Illustrator, in Maya, they're all interrelated, and getting really good at how to use your pen tool is going to help you immensely in the long run. So I've got this edge. I want to give it a little bit of thickness so that I can see it. So I'm going to make sure that it's got a color on the stroke. And I can see I've got a problematic area here where I've got a little bit of a lump. So I've got to solve for that. And that's the direct selection tool where I can, the little yellow, the little white arrow up here, Now I can actually click and drag and grab individual Bezier handles, and I can nudge it with my arrow keys. I can grab the Bezier handles and pull them out. And I'm trying to match the curvature. Now I could go wild trying to make this perfect, and it can get frustrating, but practice, practice, practice makes perfect. And I've been using this pen tool for a very, very, very long time. So I feel super comfortable with it. Now this has got to go a little bit off like that. And this guy up here. And yeah, and this is just defining the thickness of my glass. Now I could have just used a single exterior line and brought that into Maya. The problem with that is the glass requires thickness in order for the rendering engine Arnold to treat the glass realistically. Like, it needs to have thickness in order for the rendering engine to really truly create the illusion of glass. Because you think back to your physics class way back in the good old days of high school, and you're thinking about how light goes through glass or water. We do have this thing called the index of refraction. And light does a weird thing where it will, depending on where the light source is, it will penetrate the surface and then it'll bounce off and go in a different direction. And that's what causes all of these, interesting moments down here in the rendering, in the photograph, where we see all these reflections and cool things, and the way that the contents of the jar, the peanut butter itself, actually refracts out into the scene. So this does require thickness. And most things would, a wine bottle would, even a mug, which is going to be opaque in the end, it should have some thickness so that when we render this in perspective, we can see that there's, a lip around the top of our mug. So this is awesome. This is what I want. I'm going to save as, and I'm going to put this into my project directory. My external hard drive is called Maybell. I tend to call all of my electronic devices strange, funny old names. And inside of here, I'm going to call this a meaningful name, very important. I'm going to call this my curve, because as my project goes on, if I made hundreds and hundreds of curves for a big scene, then I know that these would all stack up on top of each other. So I'm going to call this curve underscore, and what is the object? It is my jar. Very straightforward. I use underscores a lot, but you'll see sometimes if I've segmented my names off into two sections. So this could be, for example, it is a curve and then underscore, and then what is the curve's name? So it could be jar, glass. And then what I do with my second word in that name is that I make the letter all capitalized, and that way I've got what's referred to as a camel-cased name in here. It's easier for me to read as the time goes on. So this will help stack all of my files, all of my curve files on top of each other. This will help me to identify what that curve is. And then obviously the file format. Now the next step is very, 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 very important. When we hit save as and we've given it a name, we must make the version for Maya Illustrator 8. And this makes it really friendly in that software. I'm going to press OK. Gives me a warning. That's fine. I know that in the future, if this was a print project that I was using for a client, I wouldn't need to do this, obviously. If this was for a website, I wouldn't need to do this. But transferring something from Illustrator into Maya, it's critical that I make the version 8, that I set it to version 8. So I'm going to head on over to Maya. This is my default view. I know that a lot of you probably have your attribute editor hanging out over here, and then your viewports are really, really tiny. But when I'm setting up my scene, what I tend to do is I'll close my outliner, I'll close down my attribute editor, and then I like to get into a full view as best as possible. And then I'm just going to say under create, amazing, Illustrator object. Adobe Illustrator object. It's fully supported. And there are options in this tool, but by default, all I need to do is leave it as is. I do want to point out here again, if you're not seeing your external hard drives, you might have to type in volumes. It can be frustrating, but that's a thing on a Mac. And then you can see your external hard drive, and then I can go into my assignments, and then I'll just bring in my jar. Super cool. And I'm going to tap the F key, and that's going to show me the full extent of what was created in Illustrator, what I just imported. And it's funny because I'm seeing two objects here. I'm seeing my tiny little path here. I'm going to hit F to zoom into that. And then beside it, there's this other line. And where did that come from? Well, that is the guide that I dragged out. It's actually a vector path that was drawn inside of Illustrator when I dragged that off of the ruler. So I'm going to highlight it, just click and drag over it, press delete, get it out of the scene. And then I get really excited. I hit generate make sure I'm under curves and surfaces over here. I get really excited. I want to see this thing in action. I hit surface revolve and then, error. Well, what's wrong? Oh, no item. I haven't highlighted it. So I got to select the object, and then I get excited in curves, and then I want to revolve it. Well, it's not under curves, surfaces, revolve, and then that happens. It's like, oh, what's going on here? That doesn't make any sense. Well, it turns out that the revolve is going to be around that object's anchor point. So I need to put, I'm going to undo, I need to put its point here down exactly where I want the revolve, I keep saying resolve, where the revolve is meant to happen. So hopefully you've had an opportunity to play around with this in previous semesters. You highlight your object, you can press the D key, and this lets you move this center point around. Now I could try my best to eyeball it. I'm going to go into my side view, my front view. There we go. You can see it best in my front view. Tap the space bar so that I can get into a full screen view here. And what's really important is that I start snapping. So I'm going to turn on snap to points, snap to vertices or snap to points. And then now as I start to move this around in my front view, you'll notice that it's actually snapping to the points. And I can drag outside of the object. I'm clicking with my left mouse and dragging outside of the object, and it will snap to that extent. I might even need to zoom in just a little bit just to make sure that it's sitting on the floor. And I can grab this handle here in my isometric views, this little widget here, I can grab that, and that also does a move as well. So I can drag my mouse with left click press down, I can drag it outside of the object area and let go. And there it is, snapped to what used to be that guide. And I know now when I do a revolve that it should, in theory, revolve exactly around this point. Tap the D key to get out of that mode. And then I can position this up onto my floor. I'm throwing up the air quotes here. Now it's set to snap to points. So I want this now to snap to the grid. And when I move over my object, I tap the F key in all of my views. Let's see what's going on here. So from my side, space bar to get into that view. I can drag it up onto the floor. I'm going to go into my front view, tap the F key to see where it is. It was perfectly on the floor there. Now I can drag it to the left and position it around the center point of my scene. Perspective view, highlight the path, the curve, tap the F key, and now I should be, in theory, ready to hit surfaces, revolve. And voila. I have what are called NURB surfaces. This is not polygonal yet. In order to do that, I need to convert this into polygons, but I might want to do a little bit of work first. But I think I've got a good start. Yeah, I've got thickness in my jar. I've got that nice indentation. I've got a space indented here where I can place my label. And I think I'm ready to go. So I've gone one step farther than I expect my students to go for next class. Really, all I need you to do is to have this profile drawn. And I'll finish the video by saying, keep it simple. In other words, keep the number, and this is hard. This is really difficult for some people, but keep the number of anchor points low. The fewer number of anchor points that you have when you're tracing something, or you're doing a graphic design logo, the fewer anchor points that you have, and you notice how economical I'm being when I produced this, the fewer anchor points you have here, the easier your life is going to be down the road to tweak this if you need to remodel it in Illustrator. Keep the resolution low so that we will have fewer polygons by the end of it all.